We know that tenants come at us in all shapes and sizes, but what do we do when we have problems, when they cite problems, usually that are well beyond what is reality? They're just kind of blowing things up. Maybe they're sending you 100 calls, 100 messages a day, and you're not exactly sure how to deal with this. We want to talk about that today, and we're going to start with mold issues. The first thing to remember is that mold is everywhere. We don't live in a desert, unless you're coming to us from El Paso, and I can understand that the climate in El Paso is different than the climate here in Houston. But most Texas counties are not in desert regions. And so mold is everywhere. Even in arid, even in dry climates, you can find traces of mold. The question is all mold harmful? And scientifically, it just isn't. The fact that mold appears on the premises is not in and of itself a health hazard. It's definitely something that you should address, but it's also something that's part of the maintenance of your tenants. If the tenant, for example, has allowed a certain situation to accumulate with mold and has failed to mention this to you, they're partly to blame for this problem. And so you'll want to know that when you are handing over keys first to your tenant, that you've handed over a stellar product, that you've inspected it and you know for sure there are no leaks anywhere, there is no presence of mold, you can't detect it by smell or sight. And so when you hand over the unit, you've handed over a clean unit to your tenant. But what happens if they call in a panic and say, oh my gosh, I see mold in the bathroom, which is a pretty common thing for mold complaints to come from the bathroom. But generally speaking, this is mildew. And these kinds of things can be taken care of with simple cleaning. But that's not always the case. So what happens if, for example, there is a water accumulation in a certain area of the house due to a leaky pipe or some other infusion where water is getting in where it's not supposed to be, and there's a certain smell that comes from the carpet, or there's a certain discoloration that you find on the wall, that in fact might be mold. And so it's incumbent on you to go and inspect. And if upon your inspection, you find there's an accumulation of mold, it's because water is getting somewhere where it does not belong. And whether that's the negligence of the tenant who is just spilling water all over the place, dropping water on carpeted areas or in closets somehow, leaving wet clothing for long periods of time, that moisture creates this mold problem. And if that's happening, you need to know what the tenant is doing and then that the tenant has corrected that behavior. Now, some of it is behind the wall. So this has nothing to do with tenant negligence. Then you have a duty to go and find that out. So part of your inspection might include taking somebody with you to inspect the premises to make sure you don't have a plumbing problem. Many times mold incidents are issues having to do with a broken pipe behind a wall where water is slowly dripping. And maybe it's a small problem at first, but I guarantee you that putting a little white paint over it is not going to fix the water intrusion problem. The fact that you've covered up the problem doesn't mean you fixed it. And anytime you have a leak like this behind a wall, it's going to get worse if you don't actually address that problem. So if you get a complaint, address that complaint. And if you can point to the tenant, have them correct the behavior. But if it is a matter of the structure is in defect, get in there, cut a hole out, fix the pipe, patch that hole up, and don't deal with and remedy the source of the mold. That's always the biggest issue. Can you address the source? Now, many times tenants are going to say, oh my gosh, I could have gotten so sick from this. I could have experienced all these things. But the truth is, unless they actually were sick, there is no cause for a lawsuit. And I know You may have gotten some distress call or distress email from your tenant saying, well, I've got all these babies in my house and they could have gotten sick, or maybe they were sick and I believe it has to do with mold. So now you're having to contend with a little bit of science. And so what I always tell landlords when they're confronted by tenants who have these mold claims or mold accusations is, number one, did anyone actually get sick? If the answer is no, the conversation stops. Once you have remedied the source of the moisture, this is no longer a reason for you to be concerned about the presence of mold. But number two, if there is an incident where someone says, look, I was having headaches, I was feeling nauseous, I had these symptoms, and I actually went to a doctor. The second question is, did the visit to the doctor connect the dots? So we've had all sorts of cases over the course of my experience here as an attorney handling real estate matters for landlords. And I had an incident multiple times where people who have pre-existing conditions want to say that the mold made the condition worse. And I get it. You're going to have tenants that come to you with some serious illnesses and go to the doctor on a pretty repetitive basis. But unless that doctor can prove, or unless the tenant can prove that the mold itself caused a problem or exacerbated the problem, they just don't have evidence that the mold that was present on your property was in fact toxic in any way. Many molds are just not. Again, you walk outside in the city of Houston right now and take a deep breath, you're likely to breathe in mold. That doesn't mean that it's going to kill you. It could irritate your nose, it could irritate your throat, could irritate your eyes. That doesn't necessarily mean it's overall harmful. Now, if the mold inside your house is at a significantly higher level than the mold outside of your house, then there is a problem which can be proven scientifically. But again, unless there's a mold test that shows otherwise, or a doctor's report that indicates that a sickness or symptoms were caused highly likely due to the presence of mold, I don't know that you have a whole lot to worry about, particularly with people who have pre-existing conditions. Again, we've had people with all sorts of pre-existing conditions sue landlords and claim that the mold made it worse, but were unable to connect the dots, or unable to say, well, mold led to this condition, or mold made this condition worse. So you deal with the source, you find out if anybody was actually sick, and if they were sick, you find out if there's any causal link between the sickness that was experienced by the tenant and the actual presence of mold on the property. And we're thinking about this in terms of a lawsuit. If someone's going to make the claim that you caused them illness, or that your property caused them illness, they have to be able to connect the dots. They have to first say that they weren't the cause. And if they were the cause, that's a huge plus for you, because their negligence can't cause them injury that you have to pay for. But if it turns out that the defect was on the property, and that you didn't take reasonable steps after notice to fix it, and that the defect caused mold to appear, and that mold caused their illness or exacerbated their illness, then yes, you potentially have a valid claim against you, which is why we always go right from the start to the source, figure that out first, remedy it, so that none of these other things happen afterwards. Right? So someone has to be exposed to a lot of mold for an extended period of time, and either A, they're not telling you about it, or B, you're not dealing with it. I don't think that those of you specifically gathered here today are going to be the ones who just aren't going to deal with it. There are some landlords who just refuse to take care of stuff, but you guys are here because you want to be responsible and proactive. And this is the way you handle these situations. Find the source and then investigate whatever the claims are that your tenant might make having to do with causality. Can they show that they were actually sick? And if so, can they show that that sickness derives specifically from the mold that was found in your home. Chances are it's going to be unlikely, especially if you're catching the source quickly. I do want to spend a significant amount of time on deposits because I think this is a big point of litigation, more so than mold for sure. The kinds of cases that we get here that are not eviction, that are litigation between landlord and tenant, tend to be having to do with either repairs or having to do with security deposits. So let's talk first about bailing out bad tenants with a security deposit. One thing that landlords do too often is the tenant will call and say something to the effect of, well, my rent's going to be a little late. I can't pay it on the 1st, but I can definitely pay it by the 5th or the 6th. And in your mind, you're thinking, well, that's not right. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to pull your late fees from your deposit. And month after month, this tenant who habitually pays their rent late has their security deposit smaller and smaller and smaller. And in your mind, you're thinking, I am addressing their late payment issue by reducing their security deposit funds. The problem with this thinking is you're actually reducing your own security because you have no idea what breaches that tenant is going to commit near the end of the lease, including just withholding the full amount of rent. Let's do some simple math. The clearest, and I say this often, the clearest indication of your tenant's future behavior is always their present and past behavior. And if presently they're having a difficult time paying the rent, but you're bailing them out by not upfront charging them for their late fees and instead pulling them out of the security deposit, I guarantee you they don't feel that, right? It doesn't have the impact that a notice of default would have, that an immediate charge of additional sums would have, especially if you are maximizing, absolutely maximizing your late fees. And if you are doing this and you're doing it effectively, you're holding your tenant responsible for their actions and not bailing them out. Certainly, if you're simply waiving every month that late fees accrue, or being the nice landlord or the cool landlord by just not charging late fees or not talking about late fees because you're content that the tenant has paid, you're losing money and you're negatively creating future problems. By condoning behavior, you're essentially telling your tenant, it's cool for you to pay late. I'm okay with it. But every time you bail them out, particularly when you bail them out with security deposit funds, whether that's for late fees, pet charges, or repairs, you're not doing yourself a favor. In fact, you're making yourself less secure, and you're making your business prospect in this situation much more volatile. Don't bail out your tenants when they are in default. Instead, use, and many of you already have this provision in your lease, an application of funds clause. If your tenant is paying you late, let's say, for example, they pay 5 days late in the month of May, which has not happened yet. So we get to May and your tenant submits their rent, and let's assume that rent is $2,000 a month. And they submit $2,000 to you on May 5th. Now, we know that as early as May 4th, you could charge a late fee. And my recommendation is that you charge a 3% late fee. And why 3%? Well, because it's my philosophy that if within 7 days, a tenant has not paid rent, they should be receiving a notice to vacate, but also you should have maximized your amount of late fee that you can charge to that tenant. Generally speaking, for a single family home, that is 12%. So that if you're charging 3% on day 4, 3% on day 5, and then another on 6, and then another on day 7, you've maxed out the 12%, in this case, $240, if they do get to day 7, right? Now, in this scenario, they got to day 5. And so that means you can lawfully charge the tenant $60 on day 4 and another $60 on day 5 for a total of $120. So when your tenant pays, instead of pulling that $120 from the security deposit, which is very easy for us to do, we can do it kind of covertly and silently, and we can feel better about ourselves because we're not technically losing money, but that tenant doesn't feel the sting. Instead, what I recommend is you take the $2,000, you send a notice of non-payment, a notice of default for failure to pay a full month's rent. Immediately send it to your tenant that says you still owe $120 in rent. So instead of bailing out your tenant, you are enforcing your lease terms. Now they're going to say, no, I paid $2,000. That was my rent. But your application of funds clause says you can apply any payment given, despite any notation by the tenant, you can apply it first to non-rent obligations. If you have the Texas Association of Realtors lease, I can point it out to you in a second, depending on which version you have. But there is definitely in that lease and my lease and many other great leases, an application of funds clause that allows you to apply first to late fees or really any non-rent obligation and then to rent. And so now your tenant is technically contending with non-payment of rent. And guess what? If they don't pay it till day 6, you can charge another $60. If they don't pay it till day 7, you can charge another $120. Now, at that point, you are maxed out in terms of your max late charge, but you are making an impact and very likely causing your tenant to reconsider paying late the following month. And that's exactly the kind of behavior you want to encourage by bailing out your tenant and pulling fees and charges and repair costs from your security deposit. You are encouraging behavior that generally loses money for the landlord. It doesn't ever make money for the landlord. And so let's be conscious of the way we are handling these deposit funds so that we're not encouraging bad behavior from our tenants. This also goes to repairs. And so if, for example, a tenant is negligently responsible for breaking a window or punching a hole in the wall or damaging a door, and you go and you see this during one of your routine inspections, 2 of which I recommend absolutely you do every 12-month term, but you do a routine inspection, you see, hey, this wasn't damaged when I gave you the keys. Oh yeah, my kid, they banged the wall and now there's a hole. Okay, so you can, because this was caused by their negligence, charge them for the repair. Your lease probably already says so. And so if you hire, Handyman Joe, and Handyman Joe comes over, he patches it up and then sends you a bill for $75, then you can send that bill or a copy of it to the tenant and say, by the way, in your next rent payment or in 7 days or in 14 days or some other reasonable request, I usually like tacking it on to the rent. With your next rent payment, please also submit the payment for this repair. Now, you hopefully have already covered this in your house rules, that any repairs that you make that are due to the negligence of the tenant will be billed in this manner. That way, it's not a shock, it's not a surprise. They may not like it, but they've already been informed of it. Don't bail them out by simply pulling it out of your security deposit. Issue them a bill, give them a reasonable amount of time to pay, and let them cover these costs. Again, if they refuse to send anything extra with the rent payment, simply use, again, your application of funds clause and pull it from rent, never from the security deposit. This is having to do with the end of the lease and the kind of things that you can add to your itemized list of deductions and the kind of things that you should never add to the itemized list of deductions. Now, before we get to the what you should and what you shouldn't, I want to talk about the rule, because not all of us are perfectly versed on it. But again, this is one of those issues that we get a considerable amount of litigation over because landlords get these things wrong. or they get them a little bit wrong. So you may find yourself in a situation where, man, you've just gone past the 30 days. Something came up, it was a calendaring error of some sort, and now you're at day 35 and you still haven't sent that itemized list. Naturally, there are things you can do and safeguards you can put into place to prevent that. I certainly don't recommend waiting the full 30 days before you send out your itemized list of valid security deposit deductions after your tenant has left. I recommend that you aim to do that within 2 weeks. But if it happens that you are now at day 35, that doesn't mean all hope is lost. I will tell you that the statute sounds pretty strong, but judges, for the most part, are reasonable people. And what the code says is there is a rebuttable presumption that you are acting in bad faith by going beyond the 30 days. But there's a distinct difference when you wait 300 days than when you wait 3 days beyond the 30-day mark, especially if you have a valid issue. It might be a medical issue, it might be some personal family issue, it might have to do with repairs that you were in the process of finalizing as the tenant moved on that went beyond the 30 days. There's all sorts of reasons why you might have a justifiable reason for going beyond, but you certainly don't want, as a practice, to go beyond the 30 days. So one rule of thumb is to make it a point to issue that item, to serve the tenant with that itemized list of valid security deposit deductions within about 14 days of surrender of possession. Once you have the keys and once you have access, within 14 days, figure out the damages that they have caused, even if it's just an estimate of damages. Now, estimates are not 100% in litigation, but by the time you get to litigation, if that's coming, that estimate will have been turned into a final actual cost. But for purposes of responding to the tenant and for purposes of staying within the law, work on 2 weeks, do your best to avoid waiting till day 30 before you respond. Now, your response is incumbent on 2 things. They got to leave, and they got to give you a forwarding address. Unless they've done both, you're not technically required to send them an itemized list of deductions. That being said, especially if that deduction amount goes well beyond the deposit, I would still encourage you to do it. And if you don't have a forwarding address, but you do have an email address, send it by email. If you don't have a forwarding address or an email or text or any way to get in contact with the tenant, then your next best option is to mail the itemized list of deductions to the rental unit. If they did their due diligence and forwarded all of their mail to their new residents, they should get it. And you'll know very likely that they got it if that letter never bounces back to you. So these are all good. This is all good evidence that you might use at some future proceeding if this tenant decides, I'm going to sue my landlord because I feel like I'm entitled to a full refund. These things happen even when there's no basis, but you want to be ready for it. But let's presume you have received a forwarding address and you did have deposits and you do have deductions, which are valid and which are not valid. Well, the term that you're going to hear a lot has to do with normal wear and tear or normal use. And if the damages that you see were caused by your tenant were strictly normal wear and tear or normal use, you cannot charge the tenant any amount to repair or replace an item or a condition. So let's talk about some pretty easy scenarios. We talked earlier about the broken window or the hole in the wall. There is no situation where a broken window or a hole in the wall comes from normal use. Generally speaking, that won't apply. So if the thing is broken in that way, it's because of their negligence. Now, there are situations where, for example, during a windstorm, act of God comes and breaks a window. That's not anything you could pin on the tenant anyway, right? But if it's broken due to them, then it's probably abnormal use, non-normal use. And so you can definitely charge that on your deductions. But let's talk about carpet, for example. This is a common one. If when the tenant assumes possession, the carpet in the unit is brand spanking new, and they're there for 5 years, and they leave, you can't expect brand spanking new carpet when they leave. You can expect through normal use, maybe not 100% of the carpet to have wear, but that certain high traffic areas are going to definitely have wear. However, if we're talking about 12 months, if we're talking about 1 year, and you see extreme wear on any given area, you can probably deduce that this was due to uncommon use or non-normal use. And because of that, you may have, again, depending on the facts, a valid claim to charge them to repair that spot. Now, that doesn't mean you can charge them to repair the entire house, right? You're limited to repair of the damage. If you can carve out a piece of carpet and replace that piece of carpet, that's the extent of your damage. If you say, for example, well, I wanted to upgrade the whole house. I didn't like that color after all, so I decided I wanted to change it. And so it cost me X amount of dollars to recarpet the entire house. But the only reason I decided that was because there was already wear caused by the tenant. Well, then you have to reduce the amount you charge your tenant to the percent that is applicable to their damage. Again, can't charge them for the whole thing. Well, what about like holes in the wall from pictures and things? Is it normal for people to hang things on the wall? Yes. And so what you have to do is determine what is excessive. If one of your house rules is, for example, if you put a hole, fill a hole, right? So there's that wall putty you can do, and they can maybe do the small thing of just filling in all the holes with a little bit of putty, something that maybe you've already discussed at the beginning of your lease, so that that's one less thing you have to do or Handyman Joe has to do, right? Now, if there are excessive holes, this usually happens when they mount things on the walls. That's a different story, because that's not a matter of putting a little putty. You'll probably have to do a whole patch, and that's going to cost significantly more money to address. So make sure you have already addressed some of these things that they can deal with through normal use and normal wear and tear, and the things that exceed that. So in your mind, you already know, and you've explained to them, this is normal use and this is not. If you leave a bunch of holes, a bunch of massive holes that I have to pay someone to patch up, naturally I'm gonna charge you for that. Cleaning is another one that comes up quite often. And so what I recommend to landlords is, if in your house rules, you want some specific job when it comes to cleaning, you need to explicitly require it in your house rules. For example, if you paid Sally's, maid service X amount of dollars to come and super clean your home before the lease began, and you tell your tenant, Sally's cleaning service did X, Y, and Z, professionally clean this home before you took possession. Either you hire Sally or someone like Sally, or I'm going to charge you $500 to clean my home in the exact same way when I recover possession from you at the end of the lease. It is at this point where it is fair for you to deduct those costs if they failed to do this, right? And so if they can't prove that they paid some cleaning service to come and do the things that Sally's service did, then you have a valid claim to charge them for cleaning services that were not completed. But if you don't mention it, it's harder for you to prove to a court that it is fair for you to assess that level of deduction from the deposit, because now you have a fact issue that you have to fight over. When it's clear in the lease or in your house rules, it's always easier for you to deduct without being accused of wrongfully withholding something or doing something that goes beyond normal use, right? So always, limit what you deduct to the things you know they caused, limit it to what is reasonably associated with their negligence or their harm, and then anticipate things that you know you will likely need at the end of the term. If you can anticipate accurately, you're likely to spare yourself a lawsuit, which we're going to talk about after the Q&A and after our break. All right, so I've got Amy. Okay, so Amy, you asked, should house rules be a signed document? And the answer is yes. Your house rules should be an addendum to your lease. And so you have them, like with any addendum, initial your house rules, and your lease should refer to them. And so most good leases do that. They'll say that there is a house rules section or covenants or restrictions, and that these apply to the lease. And yes, you should make it part of your lease, and on lease signing, I would go over them with the tenant to make sure they understand what they're signing. And if they have questions, they should clear those up with you right then and there. But your second question was, is there insurance to protect the landlord from a mold claim? Is it common in Texas to carry mold coverage? Would an umbrella policy cover mold? Well, this is going to depend entirely. So I'm going to go backwards and answer, what's common in Texas. Most insurance policies actually exclude mold, but you can get coverage that discusses your negligence. So if, I'm sorry, I don't want to say most policies, many policies exclude mold, but there are instances where things happen, for example, from a leak that go undetected or are difficult to detect, and the presence of mold does pop up where insurance coverage can exist. Right? But you want to watch out for things like exclusions that have to do with the landlord's negligence, failure to inspect, failure to address. And so this is a good question that you want to ask to your insurance policy company, and make sure that if it turns out that mold is discovered, at which point and through what point am I actually covered if a tenant experiences damage. It is possible, but there are certain times where there are exclusions. As for how common it is, again, mold is very common in the city of Houston. It's everywhere. I'm right here in this office, and I bet I could do an inspection of the property here in this office and find mold, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is toxic. And that's where the disconnect comes in. And that's where that part of any litigation or that part of any claim from a tenant is generally lost in their inability to make that connection. Like, can they prove that they are harmed, and can they prove that that harm derives directly from the mold that was found in the home? Again, I'm not going to get into a scientific talk here about what mold is toxic and when it rises to the level of toxicity. But if they can't prove through their own medical evidence, and remember that a tenant's lawsuit against you is their duty to prove. And if they can't prove with their own medical evidence that they were actually harmed, well, then of course they don't have a claim. But two, if they can't prove they were harmed by the mold that was found in your home, then that's another causation element that should defeat their claim. That doesn't mean that they're not going to sue you, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to have to incur costs defending yourself, but these issues are important to the court in terms of causation. Mold is everywhere, and everybody who owns a home knows this or has dealt with it to some degree, right? And so it doesn't take a lot of medical or scientific expertise to establish this, so that the stuff that is scientific, again, the burden of the tenant is proof of harm. Can you connect this mold to your illness? And if you can't, you can't prove that the landlord has actually harmed you. Again, landlords who go in and remedy a situation early are even less likely to deal with this. That doesn't mean you are unlikely to deal with this, because sometimes tenants just keep on coming. Number 3, I would love a class on setting up LLCs for protection, insurance, umbrella, bookkeeping. Can you create a management company to pay and collect for all other LLCs and stay protected? So this doesn't necessarily have to do with the 3 topics. You're talking about a future topic, but I want to address it just very briefly. Yes, we could do a class on LLCs. I'll tell you that I'm not a business law attorney, so I don't know all the ins and outs of business formation and business management. And so I have attorney friends that I send that kind of work to because that's not my focus. Generally, I can help where a party wants to set up a single member LLC, and I can assist you on answering questions having to do with liabilities and where an individual can shield themselves by using an LLC. Some of the deeper stuff about taxes and partnership agreements and ownership interests in the LLC, that's where that's where I ship those questions off to another attorney. But as they pertain to management and liability, yes, I can definitely do either a Zoom meeting with that as one of the topics, or I'll put it on the list of different things that I could shoot a long form 5 to 10 minute video about, and hopefully that answers questions.
Thank you, appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Let's see. Next, I have Aaron. Do security deposits need to be maintained in a particular way? So some states require that you put security deposits in a specific fund. All the state of Texas requires of you is that you keep it, right? You don't owe any interest to the tenant at the end. You're not required to set up a specific account for the deposit funds, but you are required to keep it on your ledger, and you are required to account for it after the tenant leaves. That's basically it for the state of Texas. There aren't a whole lot of strict requirements other than those. I know in a lot of cases, weird things happen with deposits, especially when people buy and sell property, or you buy a property from somebody who has a tenant in place, but you don't discuss the issue of the security deposit. Guess what? Upon purchasing that lease, you are now on the hook to refund that security deposit. So if that landlord that you're buying this house from, and I don't know how many of you buy houses in this way, I know some of you do, if that landlord is holding deposit funds, either that should be, part of the deduction of amounts in the purchase price, or a check should be written to you in that exact amount. So no specific account is necessary, but accounting is 100% necessary for the security deposit. How can we phrase house rules in the addendum? Can we state that if they're not followed, landlord to charge a certain amount? That depends on the rule. So, and this is a great question because, sometimes people want to charge certain fees or penalties for certain non-economic breaches. But the law doesn't allow that. So for example, if someone, say, leaves their trash can out, you can't say, well, that's a $10 fee, and every day I'm going to charge you $10 for that. You technically can't do that. However, you can say, if the HOA sends me a letter and I am assessed a fee, you are paying that fee. And so that absolutely can be charged to them, right? Because your lease probably already refers to their agreement to abide by the HOA covenants, which, by the way, if your property is subject to them, you may or may not want to send a copy of those to your tenant, but you will want to mention, and your lease does in a general way, you might want to mention in your house rules, by the way, you're on the hook for all of the HOA covenants. And so your violation of an HOA covenant could result in a fee assessed by the HOA, which you will have to pay for in the way that I collect for repairs and fees and other charges that come up from time to time during the lease term. So, is there any one way to phrase this in a set of house rules? There isn't, but you want to be as explicit as you possibly can. Make sure that your house rules, again, are an addendum to your lease and that it's very clear what you're doing in terms of remedying these issues. If it's a non-cost issue, then like the trash can, what I would do is not assess a monetary fee, but issue a notice of default and make sure they know this, that if they're not following the house rules, those are also subject to default, and that after a number of them, it could result in an eviction. And so that's one way to deal with it in a non-monetary way, but certainly things that do have a precise monetary cost, those can and should be assessed against the tenant, and as explicitly as you can be in your lease, you should mention them. Repairs, cleaning, HOA fees, and other superfluous things that are, again, caused by the tenant can be charged in this regular way, as long as it's in the black and white in your house rules. Yes, Olga?
Yeah, Bobby had a follow-up question. I just want to make sure that you address that. So what if during inspection the tenants say that they'll patch the hole before they move out?
Generally speaking, I don't think it's a good idea to allow tenants to do any significant work on the walls. So it's going to depend on the hole. It's going to depend on the patch. It's going to depend on paint and texture and things that I would rather the landlord assume control over. And so the best thing to do would be for the landlord to hire a contractor to come in, do the work, and then assess the fee immediately. Hopefully they can pay it before they leave. Otherwise, that exact amount is what they pay as a deduction from the security deposit if it's at the end. So I tend to dissuade landlords from allowing tenants to do anything more than nominal touch-up kind of things. Anything that's deemed a repair, I would take that out of the hands of the tenant, because they're going to do a bad job, and it's going to end up costing you money to fix their fix later. So this next question is from Margarita. I do mention the holes in the wall and the cost of repair. However, to avoid the cost, tenants cover the holes and paint the patch. It's always wrong paint, of course. Now I have paint to complete the walls and sometimes complete the house. It's still considered normal wear and tear. So this is why your lease probably already says something of you are not allowed to alter the premises in any way without my written consent. So if you consent to this patch job by the tenant in writing, that's on you. But if they do it on their own, that's on them. And so this is another thing that you can reiterate when you're handing over the keys at lease signing. By the way, if something gets broken, let me know about it. I'll let you know how I'd like for it to be addressed. If it's a nominal touch up kind of thing, no big deal. You can do that. And here's how I'd like for you to do it. Otherwise, I'll do the repair. I'll bill you for it, but I'll do the repair to make sure that it's in line with the way I like the property maintained. And so if they do it without telling you, that should technically be a violation of the lease, and you should be able to charge them for that, because that is not normal use. It's not normal wear and tear. That's their negligence. It's technically breach because they altered the premises in a way they did not have written permission to do. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. And I do disclose to them, like I just disclose the fee. And yes, my lease does say that they are supposed to get written permission before they make any changes to the property. So yes, I do disclose both. So at this point, I know that I can charge them, because I know that they're trying to save money, but it makes me spend a lot more money. But now I understand it's a breach.
Exactly. This is why you take that balance out, because for it to be a maximum impact for the tenant, they charge they're going to want to pay the least amount to fix the problem. Whereas for you, you're more concerned with the overall aesthetic and that the problem is actually fixed, even at a high quality, if not the highest quality that makes sense for your rental. And so you have to keep in mind, this is my most valuable asset. Without the house, I'm not a landlord. And so I got to take care of it. That's not your concern. And so I got to take that priority out of your hand, tenant, because you're not going to treat my baby the way I treat my baby. Okay, so last question. This goes to Megan. I'll read out your question. If a tenant decides to move out on the 3rd due to not being able to pay rent on a month-to-month tenancy, and it is stated in the lease that the security deposit will not be refunded if 30 days written notice was not given, would an itemized list of deductions still need to be sent? I always argue yes. Go ahead and send it anyway, even if they are in default, because you don't want them to have that as a claim, right? As many feathers as you can take out of their hat, that's better for you. And so you don't want them to have any ammunition whatsoever. You want to be able to stand in front of the court, hands like this with a little halo, you are a perfect angel. They're the devil, right? They did everything wrong. Breach, breach, breach on them. I even went above and beyond what the law requires. Because you're right, the law does say if they leave in this way, they're likely not owed a refund. But it doesn't hurt you to get a 60-cent stamp and a one-page letter that explains, here's why your security deposit is reduced to zero. Here's why actually you owe me money. Boom, boop, 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 boop. Here you go. Merry Christmas. There is no such thing as an automatic waiver of a deposit. It doesn't exist. What you might be thinking of is, well, naturally, the costs that I'm going to incur by this breach are going to exceed the deposit. So I don't have to send them anything. I discourage you from looking at it that way. In fact, what I would encourage you to start off is not with this allegation that you didn't give me 30 days notice. I would start off with, by the way, you had this broken window and this pipe, and you owed me fees from last month for this, and your dog did this, and and by the way, I didn't get a tenant until day 27, right? Maybe I got a tenant the first day of the following month, 27 days later, right? You still owe me rent for the 3 days that you didn't pay for and the 27 days that I didn't have a tenant because of your lack of notice. So those 30 days I can collect in this amount, absolutely. It's longer if it's on a term, right? If they owed 4 months, but if by the first day of the following month you got a tenant, then you have mitigated your damages and you can't accelerate the cost all the way to the end of the term. You can only do it for the amount of time that you didn't have a tenant. Once you mitigate your damages, your damage calculation cuts off. In short, you can only charge what can actually be assessed, but always, always, always send that notice. Again, even if it's just to email, even if it's just to the rental unit, do that. It's a CYA tactic that tends to help landlords a lot. If it turns out that you have been sued by your tenant, that's something you're gonna have to deal with, and it's never pleasant. Do you always have to get an attorney? Well, naturally, I'm going to tell you that I think it's a good idea to talk to an attorney. At the very least, run your set of facts with an attorney. You may ultimately decide to go on your own because you feel confident about the facts. But it's always best to at least talk to somebody about your case. I strongly encourage that every time, no matter what the facts are, just to make sure there isn't something that you've missed. But I want to talk about what the code says. We talked a little bit about a rebuttable presumption. And where that comes in is the tenant will very likely cite the exact provision out of the property code and will very likely say, look, you did X or Y or Z wrong. And because of that, I'm going to charge you treble damages or 3 times the amount, because the code says that any amount wrongfully withheld is subject to this tripling of the wrongfully withheld portion. And so they say, look, I'm entitled to all $1,500 of my dollars. You had no right to withhold any of it from me. And so now I'm going to sue you for $4,500 plus $100. So now it's $4,600 plus my attorney fees and court costs. And so that's when things start getting a bit hairy. Is when they start talking about attorney fees and court costs, because now a $1,500 deposit turns into potentially a $10,000 claim. And so you want to make sure at the very least that you've spoken to somebody who has experience handling these kinds of cases to make sure you're not neck deep in trouble. Because sometimes the thing that the tenant says is accurate. And if you just are not aware of this accuracy, you might kind of step into, a firing range and experience a world of hurt at a trial that you're just not prepared for. So certainly if you've never done this kind of thing before, I don't recommend that you try it by yourself. Get some help, talk to an attorney. But let's talk about the kinds of things that the tenant would have to prove in order to be successful in a wrongful withholding claim. Essentially what they're saying is you had no justification for withholding the full amount or a portion of the security deposit. This is why it's always important for you to have actual cost, the actual cost associated with remedying their precise harm. So I like talking about the Corvette And imagine that you have a Corvette and somebody dings your door. And you decide, you know what? I'm going to get this door ding addressed by repainting the entire Corvette. Well, that probably goes beyond what is required to address your actual damage. And so one calculation would be, what was the value of the Corvette pre-ding, and what is it now? That's one way to calculate the value of your claim. We talked about carpet earlier, because the truth is, even after 1 year, that carpet has diminished value. The truth is, it has diminished value the moment it's laid on your floor. It doesn't have the same value that it has, when it's at the store or pre-installation. And so, yes, it's true that things diminish in value over time. That's one concern. It's also true that sometimes a remedy does not necessitate a full extent, right? And so if it can be portioned out, if the ding alone could be repaired and that single door could be painted and the car would be just fine, then you can't charge for the full car paint job. And so, the obligation of the tenant is to prove that they were wronged by you and you withheld something without merit, which is why I always suggest to landlords that you list everything. I don't understand the landlords who come to me and say, well, I could have charged them for this and I could have charged them for that, and yada, 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 yada. If you can, you must, because you don't know what a court might deem invalid. But if you've got way more things that you believe are valid deductions that go well beyond the security deposit, you are encouraged to list them. Now, you don't have to say, by the way, I now demand that you pay for all this, especially if you don't have a reasonable expectation that you'll be able to collect it until you are sued. Now, why is this important? Well, and I want to be cautious here, because I'm not telling you to shoot for the moon. Make sure that everything that's on your list is, in your eyes, a valid deduction or a valid fee that you can validly charge to your tenant. Don't go making stuff up or inflating costs or giving rough estimates that you're never actually going to use. Because if you send just an estimate, but you don't actually pay, so here's one example. A kitchen is totally destroyed by a tenant. They, for whatever reason, were really bad with drawers and doors, and all of that stuff had to be replaced. And it cost you $2,000 to replace all of that. Or the estimate you got was for $2,000, but you paid Handyman Joe $1,000, and he was able to do it for you on the cheap. Facts like that are going to hurt you. The fact that you claimed it was $2, but it only cost you $1, that's going to hurt you. So you want to stick with actual costs. And so make sure that you are able to prove each of the deductions or each of the fees that you assess against your tenant, so that if it turns out that a judge crosses out a few, as long as what's remaining is still sufficient for your claim, you should be fine. You never want to go in with exactly, and I've seen this before, where a landlord will just zero out the deposit and stop counting. That's never a good idea, because you have to presume that some judge is going to see things in from their perspective and agree with them and cross out certain line items. And if it turns out that there is some amount that that judge deems was wrongfully withheld, now you can be paying 3 times that amount, plus $100, plus all of their attorney fees. So don't put yourself in that position. If there is more that you can assess every single possible cause that you can actually prove for which you have documentary evidence. Now, that's the next thing that comes up in these types of lawsuits. You say, well, Ernie, I did all the work. I did everything. Well, you're going to have a harder time proving that as a damage calculation unless And here's something that landlords can do and that I encourage landlords to do. If in your house rules or in your lease or both, you state any repairs that I do, I will charge, and you agree at this rate, $20 an hour, $30 an hour, as long as the rate is reasonable for the kind of work that needs to be done. And that's going to depend on your level of expertise, right? So you may be your own handyman Joe, and that's fine. If you actually have the skills to do the work and you would charge any other person X in terms of a flat fee or Y in terms of your rate, you can list that in your house rules or listed in your lease. And now you've got a fact issue that you can point to and say, I ended up doing 4 hours worth of X, Y, and Z work. And because of that, I assessed in accordance with my house rules these deductions to that deposit, as opposed to just willy-nilly making up figures that were not otherwise agreed to by you and the tenant. So understand that, yes, the obligation is on the tenant to prove that they are entitled to a refund, but there's a shift, right? And the court is going to shift to you the obligation to prove that your deductions were each 100% valid. So make sure you have the receipts to prove it, or you have in your lease a preset agreement for your rate or your flat fee for certain services. And then finally, photographs. Photographs and video are going to help you tremendously. If you have photographed the condition of the unit before you ever handed over the keys, and then you have photographs immediately after you get the keys back, that's going to serve as excellent evidence for you. If you are not accurately documenting the condition of your property before the tenant gets access, you're already a step back in the event of some wrongful withholding claim or some repair claim that might come up after they leave. So document. Don't count on them saying, or don't count on them not having filled out the inventory and condition form. You say, whoo, I'm so glad they didn't fill that out. I'm in a great position now. That's just not true. Remember, when the burden shifts to you to justify your repairs, you want to have a baseline. This is what the house looked like before, and this is what it looked like after, and here's what I did to remedy it to get it back to the before condition. And so if you anticipate this from the beginning, then you document the condition of your property before keys, after keys, and then once you've done the remedy work to relet the premises to somebody else. So that's the way you defend yourself in a wrongful withholding lawsuit every time. When we use the term ESA or support animal, it's important for everyone to know that we are not talking about a pet. Remember that an ESA, an emotional support animal, and a service animal are not deemed pets. And I know this is so frustrating because you're saying, well, it was a pet last week. How was it not a pet this week? And we're going to address that when we get to the fake ESA, right? But for now, let's presume that the emotional support animal or the service animal that you are presented with is in fact a legitimate animal, to show you something that's out there. And for those of you who would like this, it's a PDF that I have shared in the past. Some of you have seen that's provided by the state of Texas. And so if you're interested in it, let us know in the chat that you would like it. Or you can send an email, or you can send a message directly to Olga, and she'll let me know that you've asked for it, and she can send it to you, or I can send it to you after this. But essentially, and I'll go and show you, it's this HUD guidance on assistance animals that was provided by the Texas Workforce Commission. And actually, I refer to this a lot when I'm talking to clients about what the government already says about service animals. And I want to go through this with you as we talk. So let's first talk about a service animal. A service animal is for someone with a disability, and that animal provides some physical service. Typically, this is the seeing eye dog. And in Texas, it can only be a dog, right? So the two things you're looking for is, number one, is the disability readily apparent? If somebody is blind, you don't have to ask a whole lot of questions. To some degree, it's pretty obvious. And so the conversation essentially stops there in terms of readily apparent. So they guide the individual, maybe they're pulling a wheelchair, or provide some kind of stability or balance for the prospective tenant or the current tenant. That's pretty easy. And so we go through this matrix here. Is the animal a dog? If no, you stop. There's no such thing as a service cat or a service emu or a service llama. That doesn't exist. Emotional support, we'll get to that later, but there's no such thing as a service, anything in Texas but a dog. So the animal is not a service animal if it's not a dog. If it is a dog and they pass the readily apparent test, then is the dog trained to do or perform the tasks of the individual with a disability? If no, then you ask these questions. Is the animal required because of the disability? And if the answer is no, animal doesn't qualify. But if the answer is yes, what work task does the animal been trained to perform? If the individual identifies at least one action the dog is trained to take, which is helpful to the disability, other than emotional support, then it is a valid service animal. So the dog might be there because the person suffers from seizures. And so it may not be readily apparent that the condition of the person. Okay, so the answer is no. But then if you're told that this dog has training to detect seizures, and they can back that up with some kind of documentation, then you have to allow the animal there as a non-pet, which means you can't charge fees, and you can't cite them with a violation of your pet policy at this point. Now, I get asked a lot, can you make a claim for damages caused by the animal? We're going to get to that when we talk about fakes. The short answer is yes. But let's say that it is readily apparent, you stop right there. So if it's super apparent what this dog does for this disabled person, you stop asking questions. That's a service animal. And so you can use this as a way to kind of answer some pretty basic questions about service animals. Now, an emotional support animal is a little bit different, because generally speaking, emotional support is not readily obvious. It's not readily apparent. So you get to go through a two-step process. Number one, you get to ask not what is your condition. Don't ask that. That's private. But you can ask, do you have a Texas medical professional who can attest to your need for an emotional support animal? They don't have to say why. They don't have to say what's going on, but the medical professional should be able to supply some kind of documentation to you that the tenant requires an animal, an emotional support animal. That's step one. Step two is that same medical professional or some other establishes that this animal satisfies that requirement. So it's not enough for the tenant to have the need for an emotional support animal. They have to be able to say that this animal serves that need. Sometimes it's the same document, right? So sometimes a licensed Texas medical professional will send a letter and say, tenant A has a dog named Sparky, and Sparky serves as tenant A's emotional support animal. Please contact me if you have any further questions regarding tenant A or Sparky, her emotional support animal. End of discussion. Presuming that this is a valid medical professional, the discussion ends there. This is not a pet. This is like a medical device, much like the service animal. You are now informed that the animal does fall under the Fair Housing Act, and that the tenant is allowed to have this animal on the premises to serve in this purpose. Now, what happens, and this is something that we hear with crazier details. What happens if, it's not a common animal? And so I want to show you another chart that has to do with the type of animal. So is the animal commonly kept in a household? If the answer is no, you see these on the right, there's the emotional support peacock, the emotional support monkey, the emotional support looks like an iguana, which is different from a fish, a dog, and a cat. So if the answer is no, a reasonable accommodation may not be needed to be provided except in very rare circumstances. If you're getting a non-traditional animal, this could easily affect your insurance. And this is also true about some dog breeds. But in terms of these exotic or non-traditional animals, number one, they may not even have permission to have the animal in your neighborhood, in your city, in your county. I would check that first if it's one of these non-traditional animals, because if they have an emotional support lion, who that's cute, little at first, that thing's going to grow and it's going to be a hazard eventually. That's a definite no. So consider these factors when you're thinking about non-traditional animals. If the individual is requesting to keep a unique animal and the requester has the substantial burden of demonstrating the disability-related need for that specific animal. So, they might have a non-traditional animal that you might otherwise be able to accommodate. But unless they can show that specific, we talked about the two-part test, that specific animal serves this need, you probably don't have to accommodate them. And then finally, if the requester submits documentation from a healthcare professional confirming the need for this specific type of animal, then you have to consider the accommodation if it can reasonably be made, right? So what is a reasonable accommodation? Well, that's going to be a little different for every household. But if you have to incur cost for some reason, then it's only reasonable if the tenant is willing to pay to compensate you for those costs, right? If for some reason you have to spend $50 or $100 or $500 in order to accommodate them, it's only reasonable if they're willing to cover those costs. Beyond that, you have to go to general reasonability as to whether or not it makes sense. But if we look at, normal animals like fish, dogs, and cats, if they're commonly held and traditionally held in homes, that's probably a yes. If you can provide the accommodation easily, it's probably a yes. Now, it does say, except for reptiles, other than turtles, barnyard animals, monkeys, kangaroos, and non-domesticated animals, they're not considered household, right? So even if they're small, even if they're cute, again, keep these in mind. It's got to be a regularly held animal in order to qualify. Because this happens all the time, where someone has had a dog and they get busted, but then they say, yeah, I've been meaning to tell you, PTSD and what have you, I need this emotional support for cats. You ask, okay, in order to justify this, do you have a medical professional in the state of Texas who can attest to your need for any emotional support animal? And specifically, do you have someone who can attest to your need for all 4 of these cats or any one of them? Because if you get documentation for one, that's fine. The other 3 have to go. So it's the same test. So are they technically in violation? Yes, because you've probably asked them about any animals that they own or have before they ever took the lease. Now you're asking a question about animals and not pets, because if you ask, do you have any pets? And they say, nope, not a single pet. I can't stand pets. But they bring on an emotional support animal or a service animal. You technically didn't ask them about that because they serve more as a medical device. So instead, in your pre-screening, you're asking about animals of any type. And so if they said no, and all of a sudden they have an animal, you can cite them as a technical default for violating the provision in your lease that prohibits animals on the property without prior written authorization. Now, they may later justify that it turns out that during the lease term, they developed an emotional need, or they were first prescribed the need for an emotional support animal. That is potentially legitimate if they can establish it, again, with some kind of documentation from a Texas medical professional as to their need for an emotional support animal, and some other documentation as to the legitimacy of this particular animal serving that need. Now, you may get something that says, generally speaking, this person needs a cat or a dog. So then it comes down to the reasonable accommodation. If a cat or a dog is needed, is it reasonable then to accommodate for 4 cats or 4 dogs? And that's where you have a fact issue. My position would be no, that if a cat or a dog fulfills that need, they can keep one, but they got to get rid of the rest. And if they refuse to do this, on the basis that they claim, it doesn't appear that their written documentation justifies it, and you can potentially move to or seek to remove this tenant from the premises for violation of that part of the policy. But a lot of times what's going to happen is these people make either I'm talking about the fakers, they'll make a purely oral claim that this is the case and never provide documentation, or B, they'll pull something from the interwebs that says, I hereby certify that yada, yada, yada is a trained emotional support animal, signed Joe Bag of Donuts, Saskatchewan, Canada. And like, come on. It needs to be a medical professional in the state of Texas. And counselors don't count. So someone may be undergoing counseling, but unless they're seeing a medical professional that prescribes an emotional support animal, a counselor in and of itself is not, generally speaking, qualified to make this diagnosis. And so hold your tenant to this requirement.
So Brooke asked, can you recommend a good mold testing company when a tenant is insistent upon that? So this question is from Brooke.
So I don't tend to recommend specific companies, specific contractors for this kind of stuff, mostly because it could lead to litigation, and I don't want to have sent somebody and something went faulty and somehow now I've got some kind of legal liability for making that recommendation. The best I can say is, like with any contractor, find somebody that other people have used in the past. And so if you're part of Texas Landlords and you have a question about who's good at this, I'm certain that other landlords have had good and bad experiences with mold testing companies. And I'll tell you this, if you find a company and you say, go find mold, I guarantee you they're going to find mold. So finding mold is not the key. Whether there is harmful mold or mold that is likely to cause illness, that's what you want to know. And you want a mold detection company that's going to be able to distinguish between the two.
As a property manager, can I help be liable if the landlord does not have the proper items required by Texas property code? For example, no peephole on garage exterior door, or they did not change the locks between tenants.
Sounds like the owner of the property is distinct from the property manager. And if that's the case, no. Generally speaking, the property manager does not have individual liability for the acts of the landlord. Where the property manager might have individual liability would be if they acted outside of the scope of the property management agreement. So for example, if there's nothing in the agreement that deals with collection of rent, but the property manager undertakes it on their own to go and collect rent, and in so violate some kind of debt collection law, or they're seen to be harassing, that would probably fall outside of the property management agreement and could open the property manager up to individual liability. But for the most part, so long as a property manager is acting in their capacity as an agent for the landlord, they're essentially an extension of the landlord. Only things that violate that property management agreement should in any way create liability personally for the property manager.
Thank you for asking that. So I had one, last week where the tenants asked, have the locks been changed? And he's like, oh, yes, they've been changed. And I said, well, can you provide me a receipt, showing where you paid for the service? Well, it was just his handyman receipt, and it didn't have an address on it. And I know they have 26 properties. So I'm like, this could be for any property. We could tell that the keys were used. They were personalized. They were not new. The locks hadn't been changed. So thankfully, when I asked him, he came back and did the right thing. But if he had refused to change the locks, and something happened on those somebody broke in and robbed the house because he hadn't changed the locks, could that ever fall back on me as a property manager because the landlord chose not to follow that rule that is clearly stated in, Texas property code that they have to be changed within 7 to 10 days between tenancy?
Probably not. If it's a duty of the landlord and the landlord didn't comply with their own duty, especially if you can show, by the way, make sure that you do X, Y, and Z before you hand over keys or you do any rehab after a tenant has left. If your policies are such to advise the landlord, then you even avoid the claim from the landlord. Well, nobody told me I needed to do this. Why else would I hire a property manager if not to warn me of these things? So if you are aware of these things, and I don't know what the property management agreement says, but in order to shield yourself of liability, one thing you could do is in that agreement, make sure that it's clear that, you've advise the landlord appropriately in order to avoid that sort of thing. But generally speaking, as the landlord's agent, you don't incur individual liability for doing the job you were hired to do.
And then, of course, I also have an LLC, so I'm hoping that would protect me too somewhat. But I just didn't
sure. And that would likely limit your liability so long as you sign the property management agreement in the name of the LLC and you don't do anything to imply that the LLC is a sham. One easy way that landlords do this too, but that small business owners create a sham LLC, so it's not a real one, it's not legitimate, if you use it interchangeably for your own personal stuff. So if you use your LLC, for example, while you're on vacation, or you use your LLC to pay for you to do your nails, which has nothing to do with your work, right? Or you use your LLC to go, I don't know, take your buddy out to a ball game that has nothing to do with work, right? Now you are co-mingling your individual expenses with that of the LLC, and that means your LLC is not real. The limitation of liability goes away the moment you extend its liability to cover your personal costs. So never intermingle funds. Don't pay for LLC things out of your personal pocket, and don't let your LLC pay for your personal things out of its pocket. Keep a distinct line between you and your LLC, and you'll be just fine.
Art asks, I have heard that this is an ESA exemption if you self-manage 3 or less single-family homes. Is that true?
It is potentially true, yes. There are certain exemptions from the Fair Housing Act. The thing that I would warn landlords against is, because those exemptions hinge on you not being in the business of property management, there is potentially an argument where you can be roped into the FHA where you believed you were otherwise not subject to it. And so a good rule of thumb is to do your best to abide by it anyway. You don't want to skate down a fine line and then it turns out that, oh, by this technicality, you weren't subject to the exemption. And so I hate recommending that to that. So there are certain provisions in the law that maybe you can get right, but are just, you're better off, going another route because of the possibility of getting roped in to a federal lawsuit. Now, I can also say this. After 13 years of practice, I've seen a lot of threats, but I've yet to see an actual lawsuit. And so if you pretty much abide by these rules, you're going to be fine. If you challenge somebody hard enough who has a legitimate basis for it, and you want to rely on the fact that you are otherwise exempt, I would talk to somebody first. I would talk to somebody first to make sure that you are 100% on the side of exemption, as opposed to, guessing that you are based on your understanding of the law.
Now, Evelyn asked, what if they say that the animal is for anxiety?
What they say about it is less important than what their medical professional says about it. So if they say, I suffer from anxiety, I have stress, I have skin condition, and this animal helps me with my skin condition. For the service, if it's not a dog, probably not giving a service. In the state of Texas, that's not valid. If it's an emotional thing that the animal does, that medical professional has to attest to it. So there has to be some kind of documentation of the medical need and some kind of documentation that this particular pet addresses that need.
Yeah, I'd asked that question when you were discussing about service animals, because I've had some people say, well, it's for anxiety. So I would think that would fall more under the ESA.
They may have their own misunderstanding. So if
tons of people do.
Yes. I agree. I agree. Even attorneys, get this one wrong. I know what I know about it. I've read substantially about it. I've seen litigation about it. And this is my understanding based on my experience. You still need some kind of medical basis, and it's not a service animal unless it's a dog. And if it is a dog, you got to be able to prove that it serves a very specific medical need. And so, for those of you who want it, again, we'll send you out that PDF. It's got a lot of great information provided by the Texas Workforce Commission. I rely on that document a lot when I teach about this subject.
Margarita asked, do ESA letters expire? Can we ask for an updated letter every 6 or 12 months?
I would ask for it with every new lease. If someone is saying, well, I've got this letter from 1985. Okay, well, I don't know that you have the same medical needs that you did back in 1985. Let's get something more recent. So yeah, a good rule of thumb would be, is it within a year or so? And definitely within the state. Sometimes people will bring stuff from out of state. Like, well, 6 months ago, I used to live in Wisconsin. And so can I continue to use this? Well, I don't know that you're still under the care of a Wisconsin doctor, but we're going to need something local where a Texas doctor, it continues to say you continue to have this medical need.
Another thing that I really want to know is how to handle letters that you have a very good indication that those are fake. That people just go on the website and, the first thing that I see pop up is stop paying your landlord fees, and this is the letter that you need for $120 or something like that. How do we handle that? And is there a way to specifically say, hey, this is fake because it looks fake?
Is this a licensed Texas medical professional? I mean, if it's not a medical professional licensed in the state of Texas, I mean, that's a strike against its validity. If it's some organization with a website, that doesn't meet the standard. If you call, and these are not doctors or nurses or physician's assistants or psychiatrists, this likely is not legitimate.
There's no way, no list, no specification as far as how to separate them, the legit from the fake. Is there anything there?
There's no regulatory body. The rules are so spotty on this. We're kind of figuring it out as we go. Hopefully in the next legislative session or the current legislative session, the Texas legislature addresses this, but I don't see anything on the horizon to absolutely, give a clear-cut boundary on what's acceptable and what's not. For now, we got to go with the advice that we've been given from the state and from the federal government, a licensed medical professional in the state of Texas. As long as they practice medicine in some capacity in the state, and they are a professional, which usually means they have a license that's subject to its own requirements by the state, that's going to count. Anything short of that, we can say, no, that's not legitimate.
I found one with a license, and I still think that it's fake because of the website where it was obtained from.
Call and ask questions.
I did. And they asked for a HIPAA form that the tenant refused to sign.
Well, and then here's where you get into the issue of, did they specifically say that this pet served that medical need? Here's my advice in general. Unfortunately, people are going to find ways to skirt the law. And if there are medical professionals out there who are doing this, you almost don't have a defense against it, but you could complain to the licensing body against somebody who's doing this. And it seems nefarious. So just like attorneys who commit malpractice, there are medical professionals that go out and write prescriptions for stuff that is not legitimate. That doesn't serve the public good. And so people like this who are prescribing pets without legitimacy, probably should be reported to their governing bodies. And without knowing enough details about the specific case, generally that's what I might mention. And if this is going on, then it's probably best to file a complaint, and maybe a series of these complaints will be addressed by the medical board, and it'll stop this. But again, this is such a gray area of the law that people, I think, are going to continue to abuse it.
Aaron asked, you talk about having good house rules and a good lease. Is that something that you offer as a package for purchase?
Yes, we could do one of two things for you. We can review your current lease and your current rules and see what we could do to beef those up. But yes, we offer a lease and house rules along with addenda, and we'll tailor it to your specific rental. That's a service that we offer. Our fee for that is $4.99. That would include a session with one of our attorneys to tailor the document to you. We'll send you out kind of a template in which you can ask for certain modifications based on the type of rental that you have and the needs that you have. But yes, together we can hammer out what that lease looks like, what your house rules look like, and then you can ask questions like, well, what if I want them to do X, Y, or Z? Is this lawful? And we can knock all that out in that session.
And just for clarification, I'm presuming that you reviewing somebody else's, you reviewing what I've kind of hacked together over the time. It's probably just better, because I've got a new tenant coming in. Probably just better to take your boilerplate and modify it. Is that pretty fair assessment?
We'll let you make that decision. And so if you're saying, look, I really like my lease because I understand it well, but I'd like to take a look at what you have, and then we'll just take the best of both and make a new thing. That's fine too. We can tailor your lease however you want it to look. And if you're saying, look, I've got 90%, I'm there, but there's a few things that my lease lacks. I want to know what that is to beef up my lease. I have no problem with that. That's something that landlords do from time to time with us all.
Okay, and is that a fairly long lead time?
That's efficient. Generally speaking, we can get the whole thing done in a week. You sign up for it. We schedule an appointment. We could potentially get it all wrapped up in a single week. But generally speaking, a couple of weeks is a good enough amount of time so that we all have enough time to review it, draft it, edit it, and then finalize it.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in really quickly because we get a lot of questions on leases. And so what I did in the chat, I put in an email address of the paralegal who handled that. So her name is Dasha and her email is dasha@attorneyag.com. I'm also happy to send it in a follow-up email to everybody if you guys would like to have lease done with us. Yes, it's $500 and covers everything. Tammy's attorney will review your existing lease, make sure that it covers your right and protects you and your property, and it has all the things that Mr. Garcia talks about in terms of what we consider important to have in a good lease. Send an email to Dasha with the subject lease. So the last question that we received, thank you so much for asking, guys, is from Danny. He said, slightly off topic. I have an applicant who, upon credit check, has 2 accounts in collection. The response was that those are in dispute and they will pay them off or clear them up Monday. Can I deny them based on the past behavior, even if they clear the collection items up?
With any screening criteria, you want to make sure that you are uniformly applying it to every applicant. You don't want to have a separate criteria for each individual applicant. That probably violates federal law. So if in your criteria you say, look, any ding like the one we're talking about now is points off of your score. I'm actually a former middle school teacher. And so one way that I like doing this is I like having a criteria that breaks down all the topics that I'm looking for in groups of, say, 10, 15, or 20 points. The ones that are more valuable to me are the biggest chunks of points. And what you can do is actually come up with a grading system for your tenants. And if they simply don't make the grade, you pass on them. Right? If they need to make an 85 or better, and this is the one thing that that they have that brings them down. You have to decide whether or not that's enough for you to pass on them. And it might be. I've always found that when tenants have to do a lot of explaining, it's because they've got a lot of problems. And you can anticipate that if they've got explaining to do from the past, they will have explaining to do to you in the future. And so this is probably already a red flag for you. I think it's the reason that you asked. And so you can say, this is significant enough for me to give a hard pass. If they got to make an 85 and you say any eviction, for example, is worth 20 points, that automatically knocks them out. Right. And so if you have something that automatically knocks somebody out of contention, make sure it's a valuable part of your screening criteria. Whatever that looks like, to whatever degree, assess your prospective tenants fairly and uniformly and use the same criteria for everybody, and you're going to be just fine. If you have certain absolutes, those could be triggers, right? Any eviction, that's an absolute trigger. Any bankruptcy within the last 3 years, that might be a trigger. A felony, for example, that might be a trigger. And so, whatever it is that's on your list as an absolute no, stick to that. Make sure you do it every time, and you should be fine. If you're feeling queasy about something, that's your spidey sense tingling. That's an important feature in a landlord. Don't just disregard it. Pay it mind and mark it as probably a reason you're going to pass on this tenant.
I use the standard TREC leases, but if I want to add an addendum of house rules, can I legally write that myself, or do I have to have an attorney write it?
Your house rules especially is probably going to be something pretty informal that you can add to any lease as an addenda. Yes, okay. You do that every time.
Good deal.
Yeah, there's no formality, there's no rule that says you're limited. You can add your own house rules at any time. What you don't want to do is to change the rules in the middle of a lease term. Those might not be enforced unless your tenant signs off on them. Have it all ready. At lease signing, that's your best bet. Don't hesitate to send us an email, just kind of telling us your feedback of what worked for you, what didn't, what you'd like to see in the future. We love getting responses from everybody. But until next time, guys, you have a wonderful weekend. It was really great. I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. Let's do this again.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.